My speech pathologist told my mom I'd never do anything you could train a monkey to do. And I learned very early what it felt like to be misinterpreted and to have effort mistaken for defiance, and to have overwhelm mistaken for lack of ability, or to have silence mistaken for absence of thought. And when you grow up that way, and in that kind of environment, you don't just learn academic content, you learn something about yourself. You start to internalize the idea that you are the problem and that you are too much in some ways and not enough in others, and that you need to change in order to belong. And over time, I figured out how to navigate those systems, and I learned the expectations. I learned how to mask. I learned how to perform in ways that made me more legible to others. But what stayed with me wasn't the strategies I used to succeed, it was the memory of what it felt like to not be understood in the first place.
Hi, I'm Staci Neustadt. I am a speech language pathologist and the CEO at Making Sense of Autism, and I'm a student of Susan.
And I'm Susan Golubock. I am a now retired occupational therapist who has worked many, many years after I discovered even my own autism with other autistic individuals. I founded Making Sense of Autism because of my passion to not only understand my brain and how it worked differently, but to try to explain what I've learned to other people so that they're more understanding and therefore more accepting and more accommodating to autistic individuals.
So, our goal is to help you provide the right support without trying to fix autism, but by understanding it. So, whether you're a parent, teacher, therapist, or just someone who wants to learn, you're in the right place. Be sure to subscribe and join us every week. We talk about a new topic. Thank you for being here and taking the time to better understand autistic individuals. If this resonates with you, be sure to subscribe and follow along. We also share a weekly newsletter with free tools and ideas that you can use right away. Sign up at our website, www.makingsenseofautism.com. Today, we're excited to welcome Becca Engle. She's a teacher, author, and advocate who is identified as autistic at age 3. We actually connected through a shared group, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Becca, we're so glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So you and I connected and you shared your story about you and remembering what you experienced when you were younger and in therapy. And it really resonated with me as a speech pathologist because you shared something that I want to make sure I never say to a parent because we don't have a crystal ball and we don't know how a child will end up in the future. So share your story about how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so my journey into this work, of course, didn't begin with, a degree or a job title or another child. It began with myself. It began with being a child inside a system that didn't know how to read me. I was a child who experienced language learning in the world differently. I had delays. I struggled to communicate early on. And for a long time, I existed in spaces where people were trying to understand me through the wrong lens. What they often saw were my gaps. They saw the gaps in communication, the gaps in performance, the gaps in executive functioning, the gaps in my behavior. But what was actually happening was something much deeper. My nervous system was navigating environments that were not designed with me in mind. My speech thought pathologist told my mom I'd never do anything you could train a monkey to do. And I learned very early what it felt like to be misinterpreted and to have effort mistaken for defiance, and to have overwhelm mistaken for lack of ability, or to have silence mistaken for absence of thought. And when you grow up that way, and in that kind of environment, you don't just learn academic content, you learn something about yourself. You start to internalize the idea that you are the problem and that you are too much in some ways and not enough in others, and that you need to change in order to belong. And over time, I figured out how to navigate those systems, and I learned the expectations. I learned how to mask. I learned how to perform in ways that made me more legible to others. But what stayed with me wasn't the strategies I used to succeed. It was the memory of what it felt like to not be understood in the first place. That feeling doesn't just disappear, it becomes a lens. Which inspired my book Through Our Lens, and it becomes something you carry into every space you enter. I'm now sitting on the other side of the system. I'm a special ed teacher, a dyslexia specialist, and a researcher. But, I don't see my role as separate from that child I once was. In fact, I think that perspective is what allows me to do this work differently. Because when I look at my students, I don't just see data points or performance levels. I see nervous systems. I see these patterns of adaptation. I see children who are constantly responding to the environments around them, often in ways that are deeply logical once you understand what they are experiencing. And one thing I've come to realize over and over again is that the issue is rarely the child. The issue is that we have built systems that prioritize these compliance over understanding, performance over processing, technology. We keep building these environments that assume all learners can access this information or that they can regulate themselves or demonstrate knowledge in the same way and on the same timeline. And when they can't, we just pathologize them instead of questioning our design. Um, and I'm passionate about sharing this work because I know what happens when we get wrong. When we don't understand nervous systems, when we misinterpret behavior, we don't just interpret learning. We shape identity. We teach children how to see themselves. We teach them whether they are capable, whether they are safe, whether they belong. And for neurodivergent students in particular, those messages can be the difference between engagement and withdrawal, between growth and shutdown. I've seen what happens when we get it right. And I've seen students who were labeled as difficult begin to thrive when the environment changes. And I've seen those students who were disengaged become curious again when the demand matches their capacity. And I've seen what happens when we stop trying to fix a child and start designing for them instead. That's exactly why I do this work. It's not theoretical. It's not because I saw someone else and saw how someone else lived, but it's because I lived. And I've been the child in the system. And now I'm the educator inside of all of it. And I know that when we shift how we understand behavior, we don't just change classrooms, we change human lives.
I love that. Literally everything you said is exactly what we're doing at Making Sense of Autism through the assessment lens. So I love that you have the application. Like, this is how you shift the environment. And I love that you said how it's not the child, where that's what adults view is the child is the problem, but they are not the problem. Oftentimes we see the adults are the ones that are triggering the kids. And I know Sue, I'm sure her message resonated with you as well in terms of internalizing. So I'd love for you to share.
I grew up thinking I was alone in the world. I was content within myself. I enjoyed who I was, except when I was out in the world with other people. I learned to hate myself because I didn't feel that people saw me as other than constantly correcting me and telling me how to act, what to say. Um, yeah, I had to be bribed to say single words at age 2. And when I spoke in whole sentences. So, yeah, my development was clearly different. And it wasn't until my 50s that, well, I became an occupational therapist simply because it met my need to understand my nervous system, to understand I specialized in sensory processing, executive functioning. It helped me learn what I needed to be able to survive in the world.
Yeah.
So, Becca, you talk a lot about the nervous system and regulation, which we see is really a huge foundation. Even in our assessment tools, we talk about how that comes before social communication, before functional communication. You have to have that body awareness, that self-regulation, that emotional awareness. So, as a teacher, when a child is dysregulated or acting out, what do you think other educators or even therapists are most often missing in that moment?
Yeah, I feel like what is most often missed in that moment is the reality that behavior is a reflection of a psychological state, not simply a choice. When a child is dysregulated, your nervous system is in a state of what they call activation, whether that presents as fight, flight, freeze, or even fawn. This activation can be triggered by a wide range of factors: cognitive overload, emotional stress, social dynamics, sensory input, accumulated fatigue from earlier in the day. But regardless of the trigger, the outcome is the same. The brain shifts resources away from your higher order thinking and towards survival. And ultimately, in that state, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reason planning, impulse control, making decisions, is inaccessible. This means that those very skills we're asking students to use in moments of dysregulation are the exact skills that are least available to them because their brain is literally not thinking about them. There is almost a wall in between that thought. And yet our response often assumes the opposite. We assume that the child is making a conscious decision to behave in a certain way. We act like that wall isn't there, and we respond with increased demands, verbal reasoning, consequences, or redirection. Uh, we might say things like make a better choice, you know better, or this isn't that hard. But from a neurological perspective, those responses are mismatched to the child's current capacity. And what you often see in education, especially, is we have a lot of school psychologists, and school psychologists go to school and they study the brain. But while the brain is so important, right, there's a whole entire spinal cord leading up to the brain that is communicating with the brain. And a lot of people always tell me, well, Becca, go get your PhD in educational psychology. And I said, well, if I go do educational psychology, I'm ignoring 90% of what actually comments with the other 10%. Um, and the whole entire spinal cord is being missed in our schools right now. And we're missing that the behavior is not the problem, it's the signal of need. I keep hearing behavior is communication, this, that, and that. Behavior is a signal of need. It is information about the child's nervous system and what they're experiencing in that moment. It is telling us that a demand may be too high, the environment may be too stimulating, or the child may not have the regulatory support needed to access the task. If we only respond to the behavior as communication, we are responding to the symptom. But if we pause and ask what the behavior is signaling, we begin to address the underlying cause, and that is where real change happens.
I love that reframe that you just gave of because as a speech pathologist, we do say, behavior is communication, but you're adding to it is communication that the nervous system is dysregulated. So it's not necessarily communication of I need a drink of water or something like that. It really is we need to read what's going on with the nervous system, which is really, really important.
And the key
Yes.
word you used was need. They're expressing a need.
Mhm.
Um, and if adults would only understand that, yes, they have needs. I need you to do this, etc. But then they have to turn around as perspective taking and saying, well, what is it you need?
Mm-hmm.
And excuse me, between an adult and a child, I would expect the adult to be the one to first meet the child's need and then ask them to meet your need.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
But if they don't recognize the child has a need, my goodness, they're traumatizing that child.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I had an interesting response because I recently added an account on TikTok and I noticed a lot of teachers on there talking about the behaviors of their students. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I would probably guarantee these are probably neurodivergent students, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we are the ones who usually are the loudest because there's a need not being met.
Mm-hmm.
And I just responded to one talking about, well, did you ask why they're doing that or what the barriers were? Because depending on the language level, some might express it's too
Mm-hmm.
hard or
Sure,
whatever.
sure, sure.
But the response was, I'm not a psychologist. And I said, neither am I, but I'm a human being and have a nervous system. So when you have teachers who give kind of pushback of,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not a psychologist, why do I have to know this? What is your response?
Oh God. Well, when you shift from compliance to connection, which, every teacher should be going into in the field to connect with children to make their life better. And if you're not going into the field, please, for that reason, please get out of it.
Yeah.
Um, but when you have connection with these kids, support becomes proactive rather than reactive. It becomes
Yes.
something that is built into the environment rather than something that is only applied after a problem occurs. In a compliance-based system, the focus is on controlling behavior. I can't tell you how many kids I've had who I'm just like, oh, you're dizzy or you don't feel good. And I'm like, well, just go sit down. And then they see how much fun they're having and they're like, never mind, I don't want to sit down. I want to participate, right? But had I could have sat there for 20 minutes fighting them and said, please, no, you have to learn right now. It's only 40 minutes. You have to da da da. Or I can just say, go. Like the 10 minutes and the 20 minutes that I spend fighting with you, I could have just allowed you to regulate your nervous system. And the assumption is that if we get this child to follow directions, remain seated, complete tasks, meet expectations, then learning will just happen and fall into place. But this model often ignores the internal state of our learners. It assumes that behavior can be separated from biology, which, if you know anything about psychology, I guess you want to call it, we know that's not the case. In a connection-based model, we start from a different assumption. Learning is dependent on regulation, and that a student must feel safe, supported, and within their capacity in order to engage meaningfully with content. This shift uh, is taking your focus from how do we get the child to comply to how do we design an environment where the child can succeed, which is exactly why I designed my 3 zones, right? Because I knew teachers weren't psychologists, right? And I said, well, what if I talk to psychologists and what if I talk to neuroscientists and what if I talk to nerve-based chiropractors and what if I talk to architects and engineers? And I make sure that we create a design together that composes for the child's nervous system so the teacher can be a teacher. And support in this context, you know, we reduce that cognitive overload through explicit structured instruction, which is in that design. You break tasks into manageable steps. You provide visual support. You ensure that these expectations are clear and predictable. You have clear routines that reduce uncertainty. You build in opportunities for regulation throughout the day through a co-regulation model. There's relational safety. Students need to feel that the adult around them are not just authority figures, but co-regulators. And I don't care if you're in the middle of Taco Bell or in your classroom, every child in that place should feel like if they broke down in the middle of Taco Bell, you would care about them just as much as they broke down in your classroom. And if you're not that adult, you need to go get psychological help because people who can help them navigate moments of stress without judgment or escalation are the people that our human society needs. I guarantee you, if you saw a random man in the middle of Taco Bell breaking down, you would want to help them if you have a good heart. You would look over and make sure they're okay. You would maybe help pay for their meal if you had the financially ability to do that. But when we talk about being kind to another person's nervous system, especially in the classroom, it's not a psychology issue. It's a human to co-regulation issue, and we haven't learned that brains can't co-regulate at or regulate alone at a young age, and that we need that co-regulation. I'm 23. Scientifically, I can't regulate alone yet. I am 23 years old. Scientifically, a brain
Yeah.
can't regulate until 25. And so, quite honestly, sometimes when my students are overwhelmed, I'm like, oh my gosh, where's the adult in the room so we can co-regulate with all 3 of us? And that doesn't mean eliminating boundaries or expectations. It means delivering those expectations in a way that are attuned to a student's state. Connection-based support recognizes that behavior is context dependent. You need to ask, what is happening in this interaction between the child and the environment, rather than what's wrong with this child. And this allows us to make adjustments that actually change outcomes. You don't have to ask what is psychologically impacting this kid, right? So it's not a psychologist question. I talked to architects 2 weeks ago, and one of the things we talked about when I was talking to these architects was culture. And architects said, I don't care how I design the school. If a teacher isn't culturally accepting of other kids' needs, then how I design the school, it could look like a prison or it could look like the fanciest modeled school ever with all these sensory needs. But ultimately, if you do not have culture in your classroom, it doesn't matter how I design a building.
Yeah.
Because the school to prison pipeline is exactly, because we have compliance. Um,
Oh,
and we
definitely.
immediately go to what's wrong with this child. And I had a coworker a few years ago who was a correction officer in a prison before he became a behavior teacher. And he said the reason he became a behavior teacher, specifically for second grade only, was because that was the most common age he heard prisoners drop out of school. And we talked about this compliance switch, right? He wasn't a psychologist, he was a correction officer. But we
Mhm.
have to shift from compliance to connection. It's about recognizing that behavior cannot be separated from the conditions in which they occur. And I have an activity called Wire where I ultimately play with pipe cleaners to show adults this, right? But ultimately, by the end of this activity, you have one pipe cleaner with 27 pipe cleaners wrapped around it. Think about how stressful that is, right? Like that pipe cleaner in the middle that you started with is like, oh my God, I want to escape. But
Mhm.
when we change the conditions, right? We open up that pipe cleaner and this pipe cleaner looks like a long strand of sticks. We see, right? We see freedom when you see a long path, right? If you look at a trail and see a black hole and rather than a trail, you're gonna panic, right? We have to change the conditions. And when we change the conditions, we end up changing the behavior.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned, so you mentioned the three zones of space, and another handout. Where can people find these great tools?
Yeah, my Teachers Pay Teachers has this available for only $3.99. That is a temporary price as I continue designing it. And of course, everyone who buys it and contacts me once I have an updated version will get access to that. I'm not just going to be like, well, you bought it when it was old. All right, we've updated it. And so please look at that on my Teachers Pay Teachers. My Teachers Pay Teachers sign is Stitches and Stanzas. If you can't get it from there, you can contact me.
Perfect. And we'll add the link below. So definitely get in there and grab it. Now, if a teacher or a therapist that's listening today and they're thinking, okay, I want to do better, but I don't even know where to start, what do you feel like is one shift that they could make today?
The most powerful shift any human can make, and I don't want to just say therapist or teacher because I think it's anyone, right? Is how do I get the student to do this, to asking what might be making this hard for them right now? That one question will change everything in your life because when we frame behavior as something to control, our strategies tend to focus on compliance, rewards, consequence, redirection. But when we frame behavior as a response to difficulty, our strategies shift towards support. We adjust the task, the environment, the level of demand, the time. We adjust things around it. And starting tomorrow, that might look like noticing when a student is struggling and pausing before responding. You may start to notice your student's shoulders tense up. You may start to notice a child's shoulders tense up. It might look like reducing the complexity of a task, offering that visual support, giving a student a moment to regulate before continuing. It might look replacing a directive with a question or a consequence with curiosity. But it also means recognizing that not all behaviors require immediate correction. Sometimes the most effective response to creating a safe space is to lower the intensity of the moment and to address the need rather than the behavior. Um, the shift doesn't require a complete overhaul of practice, but it requires awareness. It requires noticing patterns, reflecting on what works and what doesn't, and being willing to adjust your pattern. If you can't change your pattern, you will not succeed in either career, uh whether you're well, any career really, because you have to be able to look at patterns and deal with schedule changes and deal with things in any job that you have. And over time, these small shifts add up, right? We change how students experience the classroom. We change how educators respond to these challenges. And most importantly, they change the trajectory of students who might otherwise be misunderstood. Because at the end of the day, this work should never be about perfection. It's about alignment and aligning what we know about the brain with what we do in the classroom. And when those two things come together, everything in a child's life will change.
And as we mentioned at the beginning, our students or our clients internalize how we treat them or what we say about
Hmm.
them. And as human beings, nobody
Hmm.
intentionally wants to be cruel or mean, but think about those things. If we're ignoring, if we're squashing, or if we're making them just comply, they are going to internalize, I'm not good
Hmm.
enough, I'm not cared about, I'm not worthy. And if you want that to give them a more positive message that you do care, you are going to take this moment to just pause when you see that behavior. Oh, so much great information. And I just love what you're doing, Becca, because like I said, it aligns so much with our mission as well at making sense of autism. So I will make sure and put all these links below. If the message resonated with you today, be sure to subscribe and watch our videos each week. Thank you so much for joining us, Becca.
Yeah, thank you for having me.